She'd only been dead for a couple of days. Like a few days. So she, again, the same as Mitra, she'd been kept alive, but this time for almost 3 months. Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised. This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events, and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Grave Secrets. Today we have another case study for you. I feel like we keep saying that.
We do every week. We've got a case study. We've got a case study.
But don't worry. I mean, obviously, the cases that we've been covering recently have been pretty intense.
Yeah, and this one is still, I'd say, fairly intense, but not quite as intense as the others.
Yeah.
There's not as many victims. So it makes it a little bit easier for us to sort of explain it to you as well.
Yeah, definitely. But we have got lots of other things in the pipeline. So we've got exciting events coming up. We have also some potentially really, really cool guests.
I'm excited for the guests because I feel like we've not done a guest episode for so long. I just can't wait for, like, I love finding out about, you know, how people started, what they do, how they got into it.
We just sit there and be like, yeah.
We
tell us more.
We have all these questions planned out for guest episodes, and then we just sit there and we just go, and
we just listen.
Oh my God, yeah.
It's great. We feel like one of you guys.
Listening to our own episodes. Yeah. So today we are actually going to be talking about the Kicevo Monster, and he got that name when the evidence led to him murdering 3 women. And we're going to expand on those 3 women, but that's 3 women sort of, not that we know of, but what the evidence pointed to. And we're going to have a look at other disappearances and see if they link in as well.
It's an absolute rollercoaster, this one.
Yeah,
like, it's obviously you shouldn't enjoy researching any of them, but I think probably because of the scale of the cases that we've been doing recently, this one is just unbelievable. Like, I feel like we've picked a couple where you just go, what? Like, how did they think that was ever gonna work out? They probably didn't think that far ahead, but this one is an absolute, roller coaster. And again, one that people haven't heard of. I was even looking at comments on some of the documentaries, and people were like, what? Like a serial killer that I haven't heard of? I thought that I'd covered them all.
Yeah, I thought I'd heard about every single one.
Yeah. So, I think this will hopefully be a really interesting episode.
I think this one is not as well known because of where it is.
Yeah.
So we mentioned the Kicevo Monster. So Kicevo is actually is it North Macedonia?
Yes, I believe so.
And I feel like because it's not a large area, it's not a large place, it's not very populated, these things can sort of go maybe even undetected, and I think that's sometimes why the offender feels like they can get away with it if they're in somewhere who's not got that much of an advanced police force, or the forensics isn't like on point like in a main city.
And as well, you know, Macedonia is not the kind of place that people tend to just think, oh, I'll go off there on my holiday.
Yeah.
So I think when something like this happens, so this case took place in the early 2000s, it's not something that their media are going to want to talk about.
Yeah.
They probably are going to want to sweep it under the rug because it's a negative, obviously pretty negative thing that's happened. Whereas in America, it's pretty difficult to get away from the fact that there are multiple serial killers.
Yeah.
That, you know, you can't kind of hide. In this case, it was the first instance from, you know, as far as we're aware, of a serial killer in Macedonia, in Kicevo. So I can understand how it's managed to get kind of
It'll be scary as well for the residents, because if nothing ever happens like that before, and then all of a sudden you've got someone called the Kicevo Monster, is like quite daunting.
Well, again, I listened to a clip of a resident that was talking about how even when they'd gone through the war with, like, to basically have Macedonia as its own country, even then there wasn't like violence towards just local residents. And Kicevo, again, because it's such a small part of Macedonia, literally when you look at like researching Kicevo as a place in the tourist books and stuff, it doesn't even get like featured, really.
Get like a proper mention.
Yeah. So I think like she said, you know, we didn't even get any of the war really because we were far enough away from the city.
Never mind a serial killer.
And
when, I don't know about you, but when I was researching this case, I sort of was looking through it, and I did like an overview of it first just to get a gist of what had sort of been happening. And in my head, I expected these dates to come out, and I expected this to have happened in sort of the 70s, the 80s, with the way that people were describing things.
Yeah.
And then when I saw like early 2000s, I was like,
yeah, just the way of life. Yeah. And even the photographs somehow just look more dated.
They do, yeah. So that's why I thought this is why you thought he could get away with it, because you're not going to have all the equipment, all the facilities.
Yeah.
All the police are not going to have all that to investigate, because nothing ever happens like that. So why would you?
No. Yeah, if it's not necessarily. Yeah. If it's not necessary, they're not going to pile a load of money into needing it.
Yeah.
So if we jump right into the case,
we
now know location. So as we've said, it takes place in Kicevo in Macedonia, and it was early 2000s. So on the 16th of November 2004 is when these offences started to take place, as far as we know. And in this episode, we're not actually going to do things backwards. Like
we're doing it the right way around for you.
We're actually going to take it in chronological order. So the first disappearance of a woman, a local resident called Mitra, was on the 16th of November.
Yeah, and just to sort of put into perspective how small the town was, you gave some stats earlier, didn't you, on how like the population, but it did actually used to be an industrial town, and a lot of it was factories, and then these factories had closed down, so a lot of people were also out of work, and there was a lot of people sort of doing like cleaning jobs.
Yeah, there was a lot of poverty. A lot of kind of probably larger families because they had been working class families or were still working class families that maybe had multiple children and worked within the factories. The kids then worked in the factories.
Yep.
But due to a lack of work, people were finding other ways of making a living.
Yeah, and Mitra Simonoska was one of those people that used to work in the factories. Mm-hmm. And then since factories closing down, her losing a job, she had to find different jobs, elsewhere, cleaning in different sort of locations.
Yeah, so she was a cleaner, and then she also, from what I could tell, kind of sold fruit and veg sometimes at the local market. I think people would go generally to the market. It's not like, it doesn't sound like there was a big supermarket that they'd go to for shopping. It sounded like everyone did.
It seemed like it was homegrown stuff, fruit and veg, and then she'd take it to the market, sell it just to make a bit of extra money on top of
but that
anything that she could
went
do.
To the market for their like food and stuff.
Yeah.
It wasn't. So probably quite community-based, I would have thought, with such a small area. So Mitra was 64 when she disappeared, and again she was a creature of habit, so stuck to her routine. When she wasn't doing her cleaning jobs, it would just be a case of going off to the market, but generally she was only out for about an hour at a time. She didn't tend to spend a lot of time out of the house, and if she was going to, her family would know about it.
People would know where she was, so this would have been quite a shock to her family when she's gone out and she's gone to the market, which she does every single week, and then all of a sudden she doesn't return home.
Yeah, and it is one of those where you get like an inbuilt clock, don't you? You can kind of tell when you're like, oh, hang on a minute, they seem to have been gone.
They've been gone a while.
Longer than they usually would. So it was only after about an hour and a half to 2 hours that her family were then thinking that something might be wrong. And she hadn't returned, so they contacted the police.
I don't think at first it would have been like, say, if she was they might have thought, oh, she's normally back by now.
Yeah.
But they actually started looking for her quite soon.
Yeah.
And then immediately went to the police. But can you imagine when she went to the police and they said, how long has she been missing?
I know.
An hour and a half.
Yeah.
If that was somewhere like America or the UK, someone missing for an hour and a half is not getting taken seriously.
No. And even if, you had spoken to locals, because they'd have gone to the market and everyone would have known who Mitra was. So if people are, saying, no, we've not seen her, or even if they saw her an hour ago, where has she gone then? Because she would only come home.
Yeah.
So, but unfortunately, but also understandably, the police weren't overly concerned to begin with.
No.
She's a 64-year-old woman. She, she can do what she likes. She might have found a mate and gone for a cup of tea in someone's house.
Yeah.
You don't know.
Because imagine someone checking on you after an hour.
Yeah.
We're gone for, 4 or 5 hours at a time, aren't we?
I'm like, sorry, I'm uncontactable.
Yeah. So I think in a way the police were probably like, it's not been that long, but they did encourage the family to, keep looking for her, go out and about, go to where she's been. They basically told the family to do their job, didn't they?
Yeah.
Go and find out where she was.
With.
Yeah, go and try and track her down first before we sort of start our investigation.
And her daughter took this really seriously.
She did, yeah.
So her daughter actually thought, right, okay, how can we get the word out about my mum being missing as quickly as possible? And they'd already spoken to locals. But for a place like Kicevo, the best way of doing it was via kind of the newspaper.
See, this is what made me think it was back in the 70s and the 80s, because now, if someone goes missing, you'd think social media.
Yeah.
Get on Facebook. I mean, Facebook was around in the early 2000s. And then probably put missing posters up, ring people.
Yeah.
Text the friends.
Yeah, it doesn't
like
sound
there was none
like
of this, was there? There was no
like there is a reference further down the line of a mobile phone, but it doesn't sound like they were used much.
Like a big thing. Yeah.
So the daughter thinks, right, okay, how best do we go about this? And down the road was a local journalist. And so she thought, right, well, I'll go to him. And he usually just covers like small scale stories about like local, well, it might be graffiti
or like buildings.
Yeah, getting condemned or something like that. So I'm sure he'll take the time to listen to me, and so that we can.
It was quite a good idea on her part to sort of take that initiative and go and do that straight away.
Yeah. So she went to a man, again a local, called Vlado, who was a journalist for the local newspaper, and she basically just wanted either a missing persons alert in there, or if she could, have an article about a mother that just gave some further information.
And maybe put in like a picture in there, so if people did come across her or they had seen her, it might refresh the memory.
Yeah.
Vlado Taneski was the journalist, and she actually explained that the police weren't really doing much to help her, and, please would he do this article? And he seemed quite happy, didn't he, to
and Vlado had actually, because I looked at some of the cases that he had covered kind of beforehand, and he had covered a couple of police corruption cases.
Right.
Not so much on a big scale, but just smaller scale. If there was anything that they thought the community should know about, they were kind of the cases that he took on. So I can imagine that if she says, the police haven't taken me too seriously, he'd want to cover it. Yeah. Because it's the kind of thing that he would do naturally anyway.
And as well, if he was quite like a small-time reporter, as he was described, he might be thinking, oh, wow, if this actually leads to something, this could be like a career break. It could be like my story that puts me out there. Yeah. Like he might be thinking that as well, obviously, as well as doing what he can for her at the time.
Because Vlado at the time had developed a career. He hadn't got high up within the newspaper. But how old was he at this stage? I think he was in his
50. I want to say 50s, yeah.
So, as you say, you're really waiting for that break now, aren't you?
Yeah.
Mid-50s, he's like, come on, we've got to get something. So, unfortunately, they did put an article out in the local press, but at this stage, there was no sign of Mitra. She'd not been found. There was no trace of her. No one had said that they'd seen her either leaving the village or being taken. Nothing. Just no trace.
But is what Vlado did that I thought was quite interesting. Instead of just writing the article like the daughter had said and just suggested putting like a missing persons post in, he actually went around and spoke to a lot of her family, her friends, got information about her, like all to sort of get a picture of her before writing the article. So he actually spoke to a lot of people, didn't he, about her?
He did. He went around friends and family and just wanted to get as much of an insight as possible, which you kind of think is going above and beyond, really. Probably, I don't know how much time you'd get assigned to something like that.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine his bosses were thinking that much would come from it, because again, she's a 64-year-old woman, so she's probably going to turn up.
Yeah, been missing for probably a day at this point.
Yeah. But he did manage to speak to quite a few people, didn't he?
But I did read that when he was speaking to some of the people in the town, there were quite a few like rumours flying about that he managed to uncover. And obviously we don't know like how true these had been. But someone had said maybe there was like a jealous, ex-boyfriend, and he'd done something to her, or ex-partner.
Yeah, so Mitra, I saw a quote, and I hate this, but someone had described her as being a woman of loose morals.
I saw that and I was like, please, it's the 2000s. That's another reason that I thought we were back in the 80s. Yeah.
She's 64. She can do what she wants.
Leave her
if she
alone.
wants a boyfriend, then she can have a boyfriend. If she wants a boyfriend on the side, let her have it.
But you can imagine, with it being such a small town, everyone's in your business.
Oh,
Everyone knows
absolutely.
everything. If she wanted to have a boyfriend, like you could tell, everyone would have known about it.
Yeah, they would have.
But there was rumours that that's why the police had not helped as well, because of these loose morals.
Yeah.
Like, surely not like in the 2000s.
Yeah. But I guess if they are quite working class families and it's all very traditional, then that would be a big deal.
Yeah.
So we then skip to 2 months later. Nothing's happened. Obviously, Vlado's article went out there. Nothing came of it. But 2 months later, unfortunately, Mitra's body was discovered.
Yeah.
And it was found by a scrap collector who was at a kind of abandoned construction site that was near a facility on the edge of town.
Yeah.
So it was still within
Kicevo. The
Kicevo.
town. They'd not actually left Kicevo. And this was the 12th of January 2005. So like a couple of months after when he discovered the body, which unfortunately did turn out to be Mitra's body.
So Mitra was found naked. She had been dumped in a shallow hole in the ground. Again, very makeshift, just literally dumped.
Yeah.
Not a shallow hole is not the same as digging.
Or not even the same. It's not even the same as a shallow grave.
Yeah.
Because it's not covered. Like shallow grave would be covered over. A shallow hole is just someone put in a hole and covered with it was like rubbish, covered with clothes, wasn't it?
And because the scrap collector actually recognised that it was an odd dumping of rubbish, because he saw bags but saw what he thought was a hand
sticking out.
Yeah. So again, that's not very well concealed if you are trying to get away with such a serious crime.
Murder. Literally get away with murder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when they came to analyse through post-mortem Mitra's body, they could see right from the off when they found her that she'd been really badly beaten.
Yeah.
And she'd actually been bound with telephone cord. And when they looked at the autopsy, they could tell that she'd been strangled with the telephone cord.
And then bound with the same cord.
Yeah, so the strangulation was the cause of death, but that she had also then been beaten and then tied with that same cord afterwards.
It sounds absolutely horrific, doesn't it?
And what makes it even more horrific is they said that she'd likely been killed probably only 10 days prior to her being found. So if you think she was found in January, if she's only been murdered 10 days prior,
it's like nearly 2 months.
She's been held. She's been alive and held and tortured. Clear evidence of her being tortured for months.
Near enough 2 months. Between 6 weeks, wouldn't it? Between 6 and 7 weeks that she has been held alive and tortured.
Yeah,
and within the city, probably.
Yeah,
well, not even the city, within the small town.
Yeah,
where everyone was looking for her.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And you just think, how close from her own home would she have been?
Yeah.
At the time.
And just thinking, in that space of time, someone will find me soon. I'm not far away from home. And then...
the injuries, we won't go into all of the detail, but the injuries were horrific. She'd got broken bones. Yeah. She'd got, her ribs were crushed. There was a lot of horrific injuries. So it was sustained torture. So there was actually, again, as part of the post-mortem, they did manage to get quite good samples.
I was surprised by this, that they actually took these samples. I know, obviously for a post-mortem, there must be a standard practice that people work to. But for them to get a certain amount of samples from the body in such a small...
this is the thing. Town. This is what's kind of contradictory. They don't seem to use mobile phones and stuff very often. They're getting the news from the newspaper, but yet in terms of forensic science, there's quite, as we'll go on to discuss, there's quite a healthy amount of forensic testing that was done and kept in really great condition in order for it to then be used as evidence.
I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the police and the the medical professionals doing the autopsies or post-mortems and collecting the evidence, because I feel like the police weren't that bothered about it, but I feel like the medical and forensic examiners were.
And from what we know, sometimes in certain, again, small towns, the police are a lot more politically aligned, so might not have an interest, whereas generally speaking, the forensic science side of things don't have that political alliance.
And as well, I was thinking, with the town being so small, you've got your local police force, but then they might have actually brought people in from the outside, because like we do over here, if we sort of need a specialist in something, we bring them in. We don't have them in every single area, do I? So I'm guessing if we do it over here, that's what they will do as well. So I think the forensic examiners were brought in from the outside, and it wasn't that far away from that main town, was it?
No.
Can you remember the name of it?
It begins with an S.
Yeah. Skull something.
We'll remember it.
It's going to come to us, but it wasn't that far away from the main town. No. So I feel like they could have been brought in from there.
Yeah, probably. So again, we've now got evidence of strangulation. We've got the fact that Mitra was tortured, kept and beaten. And then we've got this telephone cord, which was quite clearly used throughout the attack.
Yeah.
The evidence that we've just mentioned that we were quite surprised that they managed to gain was actually a semen sample. And they took the semen sample and obviously then held it and kept it for testing. But at this stage, they'd not got any suspects. What they did have, however, was an instance of another crime that had taken place, and that was in December of 2004. So in December 2004, there was a case where an elderly gentleman had been beaten and tortured, and again, a cord had been used in that case.
Yes, it wasn't the exact same target. Obviously, one's male, one's female, but the injuries and the torture and the beatings and the telephone cord is all quite significant.
The torture of the male as well was completely sadistic. Again, won't give too much detail, but that was really awful. So police naturally said, hang on a minute, do we have a connection here between that offence that took place and Mitra's case?
We're saying this is quite a small town, but there's some quite horrific things going on in this town.
That's true.
Isn't there?
Yeah.
You know, when you look at it and you think, well, this happened only the year before or the same year.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's true. You're not safe wherever you go.
Yeah. No, you're not, are you?
So 2 men in their 20s had actually been arrested and charged with the offence. So again, if we pronounce anything wrong in this case, please forgive us because they're really difficult.
We're trying our best. And we've been practicing saying the names all morning.
Yeah. So it was a gentleman called Antti Risteski. I got.
Okay.
Yeah, we're going with that.
Yeah.
And then Igor Mareski.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And they had been arrested and charged, and it was actually the name of the gentleman that they had tortured and murdered was Radislav You try.
I can't without looking at it, and I can't see your notes from there, and I didn't write it down in my section.
Okay. Was Radislav.
Radislav, yeah.
Yeah. And they had basically said that, yes, they confessed in the end. They confessed to having murdered him, and they gave extensive detail, actually, when it came to being questioned about how they had tortured.
They knew
and killed
everything.
him.
Obviously, they said, like, how it had happened, what they'd used, what they'd done to him.
Yeah.
It was all very much in detail, wasn't it?
Yeah. And again, at the trial, they had spoken about their offences, but then when they were questioned in relation to Mitra's obviously disappearance and then murder, they couldn't provide any details.
It was weird though, because they said they'd done it, but then no one provided any details.
Well, you see, from the research I did, I found that initially they said, no, we've got no knowledge of it.
Was they pressured? Yes,
Yes.
I saw that bit, yeah.
And then what they ended up saying is that they confessed, but that they'd been coerced into confessing, because
Yeah.
obviously it'd be quite a nice and tidy case.
And I'm guessing they were already going to prison for quite a long time for the initial murder.
Yes.
So to have that one tagged onto it,
Yeah.
probably wouldn't be any different to them
No.
in terms of sentence.
And if it was easier than, however the police were coercing them, then you can understand why they might have done so.
Yeah. But it actually turned out those 2 men had an alibi for the day that Mitra
Yeah, that's what I was just
disappeared.
about to say. It's crazy because they had alibis which were quite solid.
But the police seemed to just ignore it because I feel like they wanted to wrap it up all in one.
And so both men were charged with then both murders
Yeah.
and given life sentences. So as far as Mitra's case was concerned, they kind of thought, well, it was all over.
Yeah, and then because Vlado Tedeschi had covered the case, obviously, through the daughter, through like the missing persons, he'd followed the case all the way through. He actually went to court and he was covering the case at court.
Trial
and he released an article called "Surgical Gloves for Monstrous Hands" about those 2 men. I did read a bit of the article.
Yeah, it was quite extensive, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was interesting because considering it's quite like a local newspaper. So I think he obviously covered cases in the local newspaper, but then he did have some articles published in then a larger, more, what's the word? National, almost.
Yeah,
newspaper
more prominent
as well.
newspapers, yeah.
And so in the article that we've just mentioned, I've got a quote actually. And so Vlado had written, in handcuffs and with searching eyes, 28-year-old Antti Risteski and his friend Igor, accused of a horrible double homicide in Kicevo, walked into the courtroom. They stared vacantly at the ceiling and from time to time whispered, as if to themselves, it's all over and now we'll pay for our crimes. Again, it's not the kind of way that you write.
It sounds like a story.
Yes.
Like it
That's
sounds
what I
like he's
thought.
writing a book and we're reading something that is like total like non-fiction.
And they whispered as if to themselves. It's not like factual.
No, not at all. Yeah,
That's what you usually
I did think
get.
that was a bit.
Even the title "Surgical Gloves for a Monstrous Murder" is not, the kind of title that you would necessarily
No.
ordinarily use in an article.
Yeah.
But because of the severity of these cases, it did start gaining more national coverage, which was unlike anything that the kind of village or the towns had ever really seen, because there'd be no need for it to be covered any wider than Kicevo itself. So we then skip again ahead to 3 years later.
Yep.
So this instance was on the 10th of November. We're now in 2007. And there was another disappearance, and there was just such similarity between Mitra's disappearance and this one that, to me, straight away, you know, local community, local neighbourhood.
You'd think straight away, wouldn't you? You'd think back. Yeah.
And it's only 3 years later. It was a horrific murder. So it's not like people will have forgotten about it anytime soon.
Yeah.
And in this case, it was
Lekoska,
who was 56. And again, she worked as a cleaner. She worked as like a housekeeper, a cleaner, and she'd left the house. Where to go? But to the market to go and get some groceries. So she disappeared, and it was kind of a more significant time that had elapsed before she was actually reported missing, which again isn't anything to criticise the family for, because
we don't
56.
know her routine, do we?
Yeah, she's
she might have done
this. Woman.
Yeah,
she probably. You know, she might not have spoken to her family.
Or she might not have lived with them.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
Like, if you don't live with your family, like, obviously, like us now, I do go, like, a couple of days without contacting my mum and dad. Without contacting them. So, like, you know, 2 days is not really unusual.
No.
When I first looked at it, I thought, 2 days, that sounds quite a long time. But a son reported her missing after 2 days. But, you know, we don't know the circumstances around that. We don't know her normal routines.
And again, if you think about it, if they're not using phones, because again, you know,
you have to go around to the house.
Yeah, if you notice that someone's not been online for a while now on your phone, then you might think something of it. You might just think you're being ignored. But if they're not using phones regularly, or, you know, if Lubitska isn't using a phone regularly, then, you know,
you wouldn't think anything of it.
It could easily go 2 days.
I think with this one, because it was obviously similar to Mitra's disappearance and the circumstances, Vlado Tedeschi thought, I'm going to keep on with this.
Yeah.
And because I've followed the case of Mitra, I am going to sort of cover this case as well, because it is similar, and it's similar to what I've written about before.
And Lubitska's son was, you know, from the off wanted police involvement.
Yep.
So he spoke to Vlado straight away, had Vlado in the house and said, you know, cover as much of this as you like. We want it to be, you know, publicised. We want it to be known about.
And he did the same again as what he did with Mitra. He spoke to, obviously, the son. He spoke to family. He spoke to friends. And a lot of people said she was, like, quite a quiet woman. And she'd worked as a cleaner in an apartment block.
Yeah.
So, again, similarities between Mitra as in the job. But then was that just the job that a lot of women did? At the time, obviously, when the factories are shut down, had everyone just sort of got cleaning jobs places?
And apparently she was a really hard worker as well. I think she'd got a couple of jobs, which doesn't sound unlike Mitra.
Yeah.
But people had said that, she was quite quiet, but that she was really keen to work hard to be able to provide for her family. So there was just no trace. There was just no sign of her having, again, walked out of Kicevo, got a bus somewhere. There was just nothing.
You would think so at this stage, like, if no one's seen something like her being taken, her being sort of kidnapped, you'd probably, as the police, be looking at people that she knows, because you'd think if it's not aroused suspicion, then it must be, she must have gone with someone willingly who she knew, or she knew of, or she sort of trusted in that situation.
So the police were investigating, but there was just no evidence for them to go on. So it became, pretty cold pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it wasn't until Lubitska's body was actually discovered that anything came to light.
And I just think the way that her body was discovered again in a pile of rubbish. 3 months later, a truck driver had discovered the body in a pile of rubbish at the side of the road. Yeah. Again, it's similar to
Mitra's case. Yeah, it was near a truck stop. So again, not somewhere that you would want to dispose of a body, because truck stops are going to be frequented.
I was just going to say, there's people passing through all the time, and if it is like a lorry drivers would be passing through to go to that big town that we mentioned earlier that we can't remember the name of. So there'd be people constantly coming through. So they're not doing a very good job of, I'm sure that in a place like Kicevo, there would be places where no one really goes.
Yeah.
And it
sounds like there was derelict buildings and areas and things like that. So there would be other areas. But then having said that, clearly no one saw the offender dumping these bodies.
Yeah.
So it must just be quite quiet.
Quiet in general.
Which does make sense, because, as I was going to mention earlier, they were only reported to be 8,000 males in Kicevo at the time that these offences took place. So again, in the early 2000s. So only 8,000 males. You can understand how there probably was a lot of areas which just weren't frequented by many people. Yeah.
And unfortunately, the police did identify the body of Lubitska. And in similar situation to Mitra, she had been beaten, she'd been sexually assaulted, she'd been strangled and bound with a telephone cord.
Yeah.
So definitely similarities to the sort of the age of the woman. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's a female. The methods that have been used, the age, the job.
Yeah, the deposition site.
Yep.
The sense of like familiarity.
Yeah.
In terms of them having been taken in the first place. Also, the conditions. So they were both put into like rubbish bags when they were dumped. Again, the areas of the deposition sites, there was just quite a lot that suggested that there was something in common.
And unfortunately, in this case, we found out that she'd only been dead for a couple of days. Like a few days. So she, again, the same as Mitra, she'd been kept alive, but this time for almost 3 months.
It's horrific.
So it was bad enough with Mitra, but then with Lubitska doing the same, like going through the same ordeal of being kidnapped, of being tortured.
Yeah, you just can't imagine it.
Like for 3 months, it is horrific.
And if we think about it, what makes this case even more significant is that we've got 2 males in their 20s serving prison. Life sentences in prison for Mitra's case. So unless this is a copycat, 3 years later and it's a one-off, but copycat killers don't tend to act so soon after the initial offence. It tends to be people that have these kind of fantasies that read up about a famous serial killer years and years later.
Or idolise them. There was quite a prolific one, the BTK killer. He had, I think, at least one copycat, and I feel like it's because they idolise the person, they idolise the fantasy of it, don't they?
Yeah, it's unlikely that it would just be 3 years later.
Yeah.
And so who has killed Lubitska?
Yeah.
Because
there's 2 men in prison. It obviously wasn't them.
Her offenders should be in prison. Yeah.
This actually brought into question, though, a previously overlooked case of Goritska Pavelska.
Yeah, Pavelska.
I think that is. And that sort of made the police think, there may be something else here as well.
So again, it seems like the locals had quite probably the better insight into local cases, local disappearances. Unfortunately, again, in America and the UK, it's difficult to lose track of the missing people in an area, because unfortunately there are so many missing persons.
Yeah, it's
cases.
easy, isn't it, to sort of
so you would kind of lose
overlook
track.
it, yeah.
Whereas in this case, as soon as the 2 victims had been found deceased, they thought, hang on a minute, there's another middle-aged woman who has disappeared. She actually went missing on the 30th of May in 2003.
I think was she 73?
Yeah, so she was a retired custodian, so a retired cleaner.
Yeah.
So again, super similar.
Similarities.
And again, it had just gone unsolved, cold case.
And she was classed as, missing, but there was no proof that she'd been murdered because they had not found a body.
No.
For her, but...
There was rumours in this case as well, wasn't there? Because people thought, oh, well, again, like you would just think this, but apparently people had said, oh, well, she's probably gone to a lesser known part of town and she's just had a stroke and died and nobody's found her. And you think, well, okay, we'll just leave it at that then, shall we?
Why would you accept
that was one
explanation?
Of the, that was one of the theories. Or that she had then gone to the larger city and was looking for work if she was kind of that hard, even though she was said to be retired. You know, if she was in need of money, she might have gone
to a bigger city because there's more sort of
But again, you'd
opportunities.
think that they would verify that, but apparently not.
And in the case of Libica, it was Vlado that was writing the articles again, and he was even writing articles throughout this of like how the people of Kicevo were feeling, how it had, just
affected their lives.
Yeah.
He was quite thoughtful when it came to the actual victims' families, like the amount of people that would be affected by these cases. And he was actually the first within his articles to outline the town's concerns, say like, hang on a minute, we're not happy with this.
Yeah.
We still feel like there is an offender out there that isn't these 2 20-year-old boys.
But didn't you think with this, he's writing like how people feel in the town, he's writing like the facts of the case, but I also thought he was writing quite a lot of his own opinion, speculation.
Yeah.
Well, I think this could be linked, we think this, we think that. And I mean, he might be voicing it after talking to locals, but again, in his articles, he's not sticking to fact.
No.
It's very opinionated, which is unusual, isn't it, for these newspaper articles?
Yeah, and so it was 3 days after Libica was found, her body was found, that he then posted an article in the Morning Herald. And in that one, he suggested that there was a serial killer.
Yeah.
So he's basically going completely against anything. So he's talking about being concerned for, the people of Kicevo, but then he's also
at the same
striking
time
the fear of God into them all, because he's saying, hang on a minute, don't believe what the police are saying. I'm pretty sure there's a serial killer on the loose.
Which is even worse.
Yeah. So, very confusing, I think, probably for locals, because they're just scared. They just don't have a clue what's going on.
And they're probably not getting that much reassurance from the police at this point either. So if we now go on to the 7th of May in 2008.
So this is
a year later, isn't it?
Yeah. But this is just a few months after the article that I've just mentioned was published.
So this was Zavana Temolowska, and she was aged 65. Mm-hmm. She lived in Kicevo, in the same area. She once worked as a cleaner at a local school, and was now a local cleaner. So I'm guessing cleaning people's houses, rather than doing the big jobs like the schools. She was waiting for her son to come home, and she got a call from her friend saying, have a look on the news.
It was actually a radio alert that her friend had heard, and she'd said that basically, again, quite old school, if it wasn't through the newspaper, they used to get like here and now, like breaking news through the radio. So you can imagine, again, these women are like in their 60s, they've probably got the radio on in the house.
The friend rings up
or
and
while
says,
they're cleaning. And so the friend had rung up and said, where's your son? Is he with you? And, she said no. Zavana said, he's not here. I can't. And then she tried to get hold of her son and couldn't. And basically, it was Canal 77, which must have been the radio station, that had said that there'd been a big car accident and named Zavana's son as having been involved in that accident.
Yeah, so it was Zoran, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Her son was called, yeah. So you can imagine the panic at this point when, you know, we found out she'd not got a car.
Yeah.
So you've got to try and get to the local hospital.
Yeah, and again, one of the neighbours saw her, like, looking panicked.
And running
down the road and asking her what had happened. And she'd said, like, my son's been in an accident. So she then goes to the hospital and she is then never seen again. Because what then happens is that Zoran gets home, you know, like he would, thinking nothing of it. He gets home, his mother's not there, asks the neighbours if they've seen her, and they say, well, yeah, the last we saw, she was going looking for you. She was on her way to the hospital.
But you imagine how confused the neighbours must be, because the mother is worried about the son's worried about the mother, and then the neighbours are like, what has actually just gone on?
Yeah.
Like, they'll be thinking, they had to explain to Zoran that his mother was that worried about him. She's literally ran out of the house and ran on foot to the hospital to see if he's all right after reports of him being in a car crash. And he stood there and he said to the neighbour, no, I'm here. He was totally unharmed. There was no signs of him being in a car crash or anything like that.
So he then rang the hospital to look for his mum.
Obviously,
and they said, no, there's been no reports of a car crash. And we've had no, like, victims' families come in, and so we haven't seen your mother.
So I think the people in the hospital had probably heard it and thought, oh, you know, we'll expect people to come in from this.
Yeah.
We'll start preparing, getting ready for people to be coming in with maybe serious injuries. And then she said nothing. Nothing came in at all. And they'd not even seen his mother, had they?
No, not at all.
They said they'd not, you know, she'd not been there as far as they knew. So Zavana had not maybe made it to the hospital. Yeah.
So after being seen by the neighbours, Zavana was never seen again. And obviously her son then reported her missing, and the police were then ready to investigate.
Yeah.
It was only 6 days later, unfortunately, in this case, that Zavana's body was then found. So it was on the 16th of May.
Yeah, a passerby found the remains, and it was again in a similar situation, in a plastic bag, wrapped in a plastic bag on a rubbish pile,
which was near the football, like the local football field, again on the edge,
outskirts.
Yeah,
so it's almost like they've gone out of the centre of the town, but you know, it's all very
and I'd imagine
similar.
That the football field again is somewhere that people would be passing to and from.
Yeah.
So a little bit different in this case, because she was found 6 days after she'd initially disappeared. So with the other two women, obviously they'd been held for
2-3 months
before having then been killed.
Yep.
In this case, it's a lot shorter period of time. So you're wondering why that is. Is that because she was more difficult as a hostage? Is that because there was a chance that the offender thought that they were going to be caught?
She maybe put up more of a fight. She caused more, maybe, stress to him, and he thought, well, I can't, you know, she's put up too much of a fight for me.
You don't know at that stage, but it's an interesting thing to think about, because Zavana had also been beaten. She'd still been tortured, just not, thank goodness, for such a prolonged period of time. But she had yet again been strangled with the telephone cord before then being bound by it.
But did you see where she was wearing the green polka dot dress?
Yes.
That didn't belong to her. It's almost as if someone, whoever had done this to her, had dressed her up how they wanted her to.
So I believe it was a sister that had identified her body
and said that's
and it was
not
a
hers.
Sister that had actually said that night dress that she's got on does not belong to her. That is not hers. And so obviously the police then gave the forensic investigators this night dress for them to look into who on earth it was.
Yeah.
Because it might have been, you know, well, I mean, could it have been one of the other victims? I was going to say, you know, could it belong to one of the other victims?
And but then he's dressed her in it. Yeah, you don't
But
know,
then they wouldn't have been wearing that at the time of their disappearance either.
Yeah, because it was sort of like a night dress, wasn't it? Not like a dress that you would wear out and about in the street. It was specifically a night dress. But for the post-mortem in this case, she'd actually got broken ribs. She got a lot of fractures to her skull. Again, she'd been violently sexually assaulted. Yeah. But it did show that she'd been murdered the same day as she disappeared. So even though it was 6 days later that the found her body, she was actually murdered on the same day. But it means the person who had done this had done all this damage to her all in one day. Yeah. It's as if it was like, instead of it being prolonged over 2 or 3 months, they'd put it all into like probably 24 hours.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we talk about like a frenzied attack, which is usually the more violent cases. And this was frenzied in terms of the length of time, but still very premeditated in terms of the torture, the binding.
Still just as horrific.
The dressing. Yeah, really horrific. So now, obviously, it does look like Vlado was right in his articles. There is a serial killer, very much still prolific and present, that hasn't been caught. Yeah. And so at this stage, the police had no other option than to investigate this in more detail. Yeah. And thankfully, they did, again, manage to get some really good samples from Zvana's body when they'd found her at the deposition site.
I was going to say they must have sent people out to the crime scene as well instead of just bringing the body in for the post-mortem. Yeah. Because they found like a jumper at the side of Zvana's body, and it actually had quite a lot of blood on it. Yeah. And someone thought, well, let's take that in for testing as well, because if it's not the victim's blood, you know, it could be the offender's blood.
Yeah. They'd also taken a semen sample. Yeah. Again, they managed to get a semen sample. And 2 days later, they actually found a mobile phone near Zvana's deposition site. So, again, just... it seems careless in terms of the offenders.
It's not very well hidden again.
Yeah, and is that an intentional, you know...
Maybe the person did want to be found out eventually, because I do find when we're looking at people who are serial killers, they often want to be known. Yeah. So if the bodies were that well hidden that they were never going to be found, they wouldn't ever get the credit for it.
No, and people would just go along with the theory that she's had a stroke and not been found.
Yeah, so I think in a way, especially when it comes to serial killers, they want the validation from it, they want the recognition, and they want people to know that it is them. Yeah. But during this time, Vlado Tneskid had done articles linking all the 3 cases, obviously suggesting there was a serial killer, and he actually came up with a name in the article that there was the Kicevo Monster. So that is now what they started calling whoever they thought was, you know, the serial killer that they thought was carrying out these crimes.
So 3 days after Zvana was found, on the 19th of May, Vlado, as you say, then was really proud of himself, had coined this term, the Kicevo Monster, and actually went to the national newspaper, which was called Nova Macedonia newspaper. Yeah. Very imaginative title. But went to Nova Macedonia and said, look, we've got this big breaking case and you should cover it. And they did. So the largest national newspaper has then got hold of this story, printed Vlado's article, which links all 3 cases, suggesting a serial killer, coining the phrase or the term, the Kicevo Monster, and then bringing massively into question the police investigation. Because, again, we've got these 2 people that are already serving life sentences for Mitra's case, which was the first.
Because these 2 men are obviously still in prison at this point, their case was then actually reviewed, because they thought, well, they can't be... you know, they couldn't have done all this. So they actually had a look at the semen sample that was taken from Mitra's body, and that evidence was never presented in court because it wasn't a match to either of the 2 men. So that evidence was sort of just ignored and swept under the carpet.
Yeah.
But when the semen sample from Mitra's body was compared to the semen sample from Zavana's body, the samples both matched. So we knew then it's a link, and especially to those two, that it is the same person that has done offender. This. Yeah.
What I found really interesting as well is as Vlado's kind of doing his own detective work, and obviously the police have been called into question by Vlado at this stage on like a national level.
Yeah. Quite embarrassing.
He still interviewed them, and he interviewed the officers on the case, and they then, like you say, admitted that they needed to look further into the evidence. So Vlado's spoken to the police officers, he's obviously been speaking to friends and family, and now they are looking at the fact that it doesn't seem that these two boys in the 20s were actually responsible for killing Mitra, which then means that they also, obviously, because they're in prison, didn't commit the further offences. Yeah. So we're now looking for a new offender.
But also at the same time, we know that the semen samples matched from the bodies, so we know it was the same person.
Yeah.
But then who is that person? And when that was run through the database, there wasn't actually a match on the system for that semen sample to match the DNA. And it's strange for someone to not be on the system when they're committing such horrendous crimes, because I'm sure we've mentioned before, you don't normally go straight in with horrific torture and murder.
No.
You would start off petty crimes or have at least some history of something.
And generally with like sexual abuse, we tend to find that it starts out by being like a peeping Tom.
Yeah.
It might be public indecency.
Yeah, and then it gets
exposure,
worse.
And then it escalates to a sexual assault and then potential sexual assault with then murder. And it just wasn't the case in this instance.
But I think now is when the time that the police thought, right, we actually probably do need to do a lot more than we have been doing.
Now we should.
And do more of a thorough investigation. So we've got the DNA testing, and I know that the police actually interviewed hundreds of men, and they got someone in to create a profile of the person, so a profile of the killer. And I feel like these, sometimes we spoke to Linda about profiling, didn't we?
Sorry, I'm trying to open my Coke.
Trying to do it quietly. We spoke to Linda Sage about profiling, and it can be, it's a good guide for the police, isn't it? But sometimes it can be a bit of hit and miss. And I'm not sure how qualified this person was, because she was a self-proclaimed, what's it called? Psychic, wasn't she?
Right, okay.
So,
and again, like you've just mentioned, it's a guide. There have been cases where the police have put far too much weight into, just pinning whoever fits the profile as being the offender, when actually it should just be a guide in terms of potentially narrowing down your suspect pool, but not ruling anyone out just based on the profile.
And I feel like what the profile said is basically what we could have put together ourselves. So suggested that the killer wanted the bodies to be found eventually, which we've just talked about. Lived in the same area. Well, obviously, because all the women were from there, all the bodies were found there. So we'd have thought that they were known to the women. We've mentioned about that because there was no sign of them being taken. He was quite, they said that he was probably quite intelligent, maybe had a problemed upbringing. But to me, all this, he's got to be physically strong enough to attack the women. All this is a pretty given to
also,
me.
the age range was between 15 and 60.
That's quite a wide age
Get
range.
A still of our faces there.
So for some reason, I don't know how they managed to do this, but from this information from the profiler, they actually managed to narrow it down to 3 people. I know they didn't have a lot of people to, to start with. It's not like they've got millions to go through, but to narrow it down so
massively in
to
that
3 people, and then just put 3 people into surveillance.
One thing again to note, so they said troubled childhood, and then they said with sexual perversions that had likely kind of originated during early childhood or like teen youth stage, but that it was severe sexual frustration. So again, that's really interesting because based on what we've just said about there being no DNA profile match already in the system, you would expect with that part of the profile for there to have been prior offences leading up to it. Because if they're talking, right, so we've got the age range of 15 to 60, but if you're going like 30 and above, then of course you would expect other instances of prior
to have cropped
crimes.
up somewhere, yeah, definitely.
So as I mentioned earlier, there were 8,000 males in Kicevo at that time, which really isn't a lot. I mean, I'd like to do in Yorkshire, how many males there are, but I don't know for comparison. No, but not a lot of males. They then interviewed 250 men. Like, God knows how long that would have taken. We spoke in a previous case about interviewing 5 people at the same time.
Yeah.
So 250 must just be...
taken a long time.
Yeah, crazy. Then 15 of those samples had their blood taken.
Why only 15 out of them? Was it like a resource thing?
Well, I don't know. I assume that maybe they ruled people out on alibi and then it was left with 15 that both fitted the profile and potentially didn't have alibis.
You'd think they'd narrow it down and take the samples of the 3 people. Because if they're narrowing it down to put them under surveillance, you'd think they'd have enough on them at that point, but obviously not.
Interestingly, from what I could gather, they took 15 samples of blood, but they didn't test all 15.
Okay.
Because obviously it's expensive. We've talked about the amount that forensic science costs. And again, if we're talking about a small place like Kicevo, yes, they'll probably palm it out to larger areas for testing, but it still costs Kicevo the money for investigating. So as far as I know, 15 samples were taken, but then the reason that they then had the 3 under surveillance was to basically work out who to then have of those 15 actually tested for DNA.
And at this time as well, they'd also taken the jumper and took the blood off there and tested the blood.
Yeah.
And the blood did actually come back as a match, didn't it, to someone?
So we've got 3 people that have been kind of narrowed down as key suspects. The police had kept it all very much under wraps at this stage, hadn't they? Yes, they were under surveillance, but nobody was kind of aware of it. And then this positive match came back.
Can you imagine the shock when this match comes back?
And interestingly, although they're keeping it under wraps, the police do contact the local I think the local newspaper, the Kicevo local newspaper, and said, just an FYI, we are about to arrest someone. So they'd kind of given them the lead.
A bit of a heads up.
So the editor of the newspaper, obviously, who's the first person you're going to ring? Vlado.
Yeah, because he's covered all the cases.
It's his kind of case that he's been covering. So starts ringing Vlado, and Vlado's not answering, and they're like, come on, like, this is the biggest break.
This is what you wanted. This is the break in your career.
And they can't get hold of Vlado. So ends up ringing the police back. The editor rings the police back and is like, has Vlado turned up to you guys?
Yeah, to cover the story.
And in fact, that's exactly what had happened. Vlado had gone to the police to say, have you got any updates on the case? And at that stage, Vlado Tenensky had been arrested on suspicion of the 3 murders.
Because the blood on the jumper found at the side of the body matched Vlado Tenensky.
And this is just mind-blowing. He's been covering this case for years, literally since 2004
to 2008. So 4 years of his life have been covering these cases.
He's interviewed friends, family, he's interviewed the police officers, and it turns out at that stage that he had actually been questioned multiple times.
He'd kept that quiet, hadn't he?
But he hadn't said anything,
Yeah.
And again, if you were being questioned, you'd think that because it's his case he's covering, he'd have like gone into work. Because again, he was well known at work. Yeah, if that were me and I'd been working on the case for so long, I'd go in to work and I'd be like,
You'll never guess what.
I've got an insight now. They've interviewed me.
Yeah.
But he just kept it really quiet. So.
That's suspicious.
That's suspicious.
I've not said suspicious this episode, so I was like, I've got to get that in somewhere.
So Vlado was arrested, and obviously it then all unravels in terms of why he was under suspicion in the first place, how the police were alerted to him, and we're now going to talk about basically the unraveling of Vlado, because slight spoiler alert, it was Vlado. So we are now going to discuss what led him to be a suspect in the first place, because he'd gone undetected for 4 years, right in front of literally everyone.
When you say like he was under the nose of everyone, he was literally there.
Interviewing, he was in the victims' families' homes.
Yeah, but the thing is that I was thinking about for this one, so Mitra, who went missing first, who was held for 2 months, he's interviewing her family and her friends. He's got her held wherever horrific. He was holding
Absolutely
Mitra.
Horrific.
He had got her at home, and they're saying, oh, we can't find her, we're worried about her. He's seen all these people be so worried about these 3 women and carried on.
And in one of his articles, it even said, like, we don't know the motive, what a monster, like, who would do something like this? It's like,
you. Yeah. You're writing.
It's so awful.
You're writing about yourself.
Unbelievable. It's ridiculous.
It is crazy.
So the police had initially been alerted to the fact that he might be potential suspect because of his articles. He was the first one to suggest that it was a serial killer, and that it wasn't in fact the 2 20-year-old boys. He also then mentioned that Zavana had been coaxed out of a house. Now, we talked about Zavana having left a house because she thought that Zoran, her son, was in a car accident. It turns out that Canal 77, which was the radio show, the radio channel, Vlado still worked there. He had started out in radio, and he still had the ability to be able to kind of put these news pieces,
these alerts out there,
on the radio.
Yeah.
So he had the means to do so, and it was just a hoax to lure Zavana out of her home.
And that's probably why she never made it to the hospital, because he knew the exact route she was going to take to get from her house to the hospital.
God, it's so well calculated, but then also so chaotic and not...
It actually turns out as well that when we said, the profiler had said, the killer must be known to the women, he was known to the women because he was local. It was a close-knit community, but they were also had worked with his mother at some point along the way.
So all of the victims had worked with his mother within a cleaning capacity. But then what I couldn't believe is Lubitska had also been his cleaner. So he was living alone at the time, but Lubitska had actually cleaned for him because she already knew him from previously having worked together at one of these factories.
Yeah.
So again, fits the profile. They knew each other. But what actually cemented the police's suspicions was actually when he was reporting on Lubitska's murder, and he'd actually mentioned that the telephone cord had been used, which at that stage hadn't been released by the police. So how could he be reporting on it and putting it out there unless either a police officer had said too much or
he
was the offender?
But do you think that was on purpose? That to me seems like a bit of a schoolboy error, and he didn't seem that much like a schoolboy error type of guy.
No.
And I seem to think that could have been on purpose, because if someone else is taking credit for what you've done and you want to be known for it, like we said, the bodies were not hidden, and you've got these 2 men, he was the first person to say, oh, well, these 2 men couldn't be responsible for it. Is he almost like directing them?
I also think, if you think you've got away with it for that long, clearly he was growing in confidence.
Yeah.
So, he was probably leaving kind of clues for the police, thinking, well, they've not caught me yet. I'm going to give them something so obvious
that they can't not.
I bet they still don't catch me.
He's cocky, isn't he? He's just got too full of himself and too cocky. So it was actually the 20th of June 2008 when Vlado was arrested. But initially, he refused to speak. He didn't ask for like a lawyer or anything straight away. But the lab results came in and the semen samples from Mitra's body and Zavana's body also matched Vlado Tedeschi. But it makes you think, if they would have tested that sample they got from Mitra immediately instead of keeping it, that could have stopped those other two women getting killed and tortured in the most horrific way.
Would they have linked it to him at that stage, though? Because they wouldn't have had his blood sample.
Because he wasn't on the database already. Yeah, I suppose.
So it's a tricky one because, again, it begs the question, should we all be on the database? Yeah. But at that stage, because it was the blood on the jumper, the jersey that they'd found, and then the semen samples, it was only the murders of Mitra and Zavana that he could be charged with at that stage.
Yeah, Lubitsa they'd not got anything to tie to Lubitsa's murder at this point, but they did actually find a couple of hairs near her body, and they were also sent off to be tested because I don't think they'd got a great deal much more evidence.
And they were found
Lubitsa.
Near her body, not on her body as well, which I found was interesting because if you think of like the horrific nature of the deposition site, it was rubbish. It was a rubbish heap in all of the cases.
Yeah, just to take those two.
So to find human hairs, they must have done, again, a really good job in terms of the forensic investigation.
Yeah.
So at this stage, Vlado is being held, again, for 24 hours, but on the murder of 2 of the victims.
Yeah.
And I think he probably felt really cocky at this stage because he's thinking, right, well, they've not got enough to charge me with all 3. So he just didn't say anything. And at this stage, his colleagues, I saw an interview with the editor, his boss, and his boss said that's when I first thought that he might have something to do with it because it was really odd that he didn't get a lawyer or speak to me or...
Yeah, you would do it. If you're innocent, you'd be like, right, I need to prove it. Like, your friends or your family, like, can someone help me out?
And again, if your boss is the manager of a newspaper, you'd be like, tell everyone I'm being wrongly convicted.
Yeah.
Like, can you start your own investigation?
And as well, if you know the person, like if it was, say if I was arrested for murder and I said to you, I rang you and said, Beth, I need you to help me, you'd be thinking, well, she's not like that. I know that she won't murder someone, so I'll go and help her. But like, it was all like, oh, well, he might have, we could have.
I know.
It was very like,
you
know, if you know someone, I feel like you know if they're going to do that, if they could.
Yeah, we should do a whole episode on whether or not you'd ring me if you killed someone, but we'll save that for like an extra.
I already know who I'd ring. I've already got him on, just in case a criminal lawyer, just in case anything ever did happen. Not that I've ever been arrested or anything, guys. I've never done anything, but you know, you've got to have these just in case.
Yeah, you just, conversations at dinner.
Yeah, why not?
So again, all of this forensic evidence is being processed. We have the human hairs. The jersey the blood was confirmed to be Vlado's. And they actually then later confirmed, because again, they're trying to find as much evidence as possible to prove that he's connected to Lubitska's murder. However, they then tested the polka dot nightdress that Zavana was found in.
Yeah.
And that was confirmed to be a match as belonging to Vlado's mother.
See, that's weird because why would you dress a victim in your mum's outfits, not just to like torture them? I mean, I'm not saying I understand it, but I mean, if they'd had a bad relationship and then maybe he wanted to he felt like in his head he was getting his own back on his mum by dressing these women who were similar to his mum in these outfits, but then to sexually assault them as well.
It's very like, Bates Motel.
Yes, it is, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we are now going to talk about potentially the motive behind Vlado Tedeschi's offences and also just give you a little bit of insight into him as a person.
Yeah.
Because at this stage we've been kind of very top level, but I think if we give you a bit more context, it does give a bit of a suggestion about what the motive might have been.
Yeah, so Vlado Tănăscu was born in 1952. He was born in Kicevo, so he was a local. He'd lived in that area all of his life.
Yeah.
He had 2 siblings, but I saw quite a lot on his mother and father and how locals were saying they were quite strict disciplinarians.
Yeah, very
strict. Really strict.
His father had actually been in World War II, so
Yeah.
you can imagine what kind of impact that would have had.
Yeah.
And I think they were both very... It hasn't been said directly abusive, but strict, you know.
Very, very, very strict.
And sorry, when the 2 older siblings had actually moved away, because they got out of Kicevo pretty early on.
Yeah.
But when they actually left, because it was such a close family and you're not meant to leave the area that you come from, they'd actually been disinherited.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he was the only one left, really.
So he was the only one left and probably scared of doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
His brother had said that he'd actually not spoken to Vlado in about 30 years.
Yeah.
Because he was the one that had stayed behind.
But his brother did say there was nothing when he was there that was a massive cause for concern.
No, it was
he
just
was a normal child. But even though it was his dad that was like the World War II vet and they were quite strict, he also didn't have a good relationship with his mother. And I find in these situations when we do backgrounds on killers, sometimes you find they've either got a closer relationship with the mom and that's what the dad doesn't like.
Yeah.
But in this case, it was a bad relationship with his mother as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because he obviously didn't have good, or he had fractured relationships with his mother and father.
Yeah.
But they were obviously really complicated relationships because he still lived nearby.
Yeah.
He had, you know, he was close with them.
Yeah.
But they were difficult relationships. But Vlado, as we mentioned, had a career in journalism for a number of years. He'd actually won awards. He'd got a wife. He had a wife and had actually got then a child. Went on to have 2 children. Yeah, went on to have 2 children. And they were known to be a hard-working family.
Did you see the jobs of them?
Yeah.
Linguist and poet and doctor. So they'd got very... very reputable.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she was I want to say the first lawyer in Kicevo, first female lawyer in Kicevo. So again, they were well known in the area, but basically what had happened is Vlado had lost his job. And then his wife, had gone to the capital city and had then taken the kids and was working in the capital city.
But they were still very much together at this point, weren't they?
Very much together.
They'd not broke up or separated?
The plan was Vlado would spend weekends with the family, but then would go back to Kicevo where he already had his job and then effectively save up enough money that they could all then be kind of reunited.
And I feel like she was quite good at what she did because she got quite a few promotions. She was the first female lawyer. So I feel like it might have been when they moved over, maybe she was sort of the main... breadwinner in the family.
Well, she'd actually said that Vlado was quite happy with her being like a strong, independent woman and that he was supportive of that.
Yeah.
And that she actually really loved the fact that he wasn't as traditional as most of the other men in Kicevo.
Yeah.
So if we give a couple of dates for reference, so it was 2002 that actually his father died, but his father actually committed suicide.
Yeah, I think he hung himself. Didn't I?
Yes. And then later that same year, his mother actually also died, and that was of a suspected accidental overdose.
Yeah, I see. There was only like months, if that, between him losing his father and then his mother. So I think that would have
incredibly
had an impact.
Tragic and has a massive impact on anyone. And then especially if you've got complicated relationships with these people, it's kind of that never being able to lay it to rest because you didn't get to say probably what he wanted to. So it was then, that was 2002. 2003 is then unfortunately when his family then moved away. Yes, they were still seeing each other, but then Vlado was left in Kicevo living alone. And it's at that stage that the offences started taking place. So forensic evidence then found that he had in fact been keeping the victims at his family summer home and his own home.
Yeah, there was actually items found, like shoes.
Yeah,
were found from the victims. So he
just
had
laid
been,
out
yeah,
like they'd just
like
left
they'd just come into the house and taken the shoes off, weren't they? It was really, really strange. So there was a lot of evidence pointing to Vlado at this point, wasn't there? So the judge actually ordered that he was to be detained for 30 days. He was transferred to a prison. I mean, not just 30 days in total. That's just while they sort out, sort of, I suppose, where you're going and what they're going to do with you, because there weren't, like they said, 43 miles away, there wasn't probably a prison in Kicevo. It had to be the main town.
Well, interestingly, there was, and we'll talk about it a little bit in a minute, but the thought was that because it was such a serious offence and there was overpopulation of local prisons, that was kind of the only option for him.
Right.
So there was a bit of, again, the newspaper, when they were reporting on it, they had kind of brought into question why he'd been taken elsewhere.
But then he was still put into a cell with 3 people.
Yes.
So that's still quite crowded.
Yeah, very overcrowded. Yeah. But apparently that was out of the ordinary.
Yeah.
And that he should have been on his own. Obviously, extra precautions should have been taken because it was such a serious offence, but he still ended up with 3 other cellmates. So this is where another twist comes in completely, because we now know that Vlado is the offender. The police have finally got him in custody. He's being held in a prison in the town. And on the 23rd of June, which was, I believe, 3 days, or not even that, was it?
No. 23rd of June. So he went in on the 20th. Yeah. He got took into prison on the 21st, so 2 days after.
Yeah, so 21st, he's taken in. 23rd, Vlado was actually found deceased by another one of his cellmates after having reportedly committed suicide by dunking his head in a bucket of water. So again, they were having trouble with all of the water systems, and so they were giving people either bottles of water or buckets of water.
Yeah, sort of to wash and stuff in general, weren't they?
Yeah.
So, but a bucket of water is hard. You must have so much willpower to kill yourself in a bucket of water.
But then his hands were found at either side of his body, reportedly, and then he was supposedly dragged out by prison officers and then laid out in the hallway.
And apparently they tried to resuscitate him, didn't they? And then the doctor was called to try and resuscitate him.
It just all happened very quickly, and there was a lot of speculation in this case as to whether or not Vlado had actually taken his own life. So the case, unfortunately, could never go to trial because, again, the laws in Kicevo stated that as Vlado had died, they couldn't then take the case any further.
That's just no closure for the families, though, is it really?
No.
But the strange thing to me was some of the family members didn't think he'd done it.
Yeah. The one thing that is, again, really strange about the case is that some people said he was an absolutely amazing journalist and that he deserved the awards and he was better than some of the people that were older than him. Some people said he was a horrendous journalist and that he stole stories. One of the women that I saw in a documentary said that he was weird and she got a bad feeling about him.
Yeah.
Loads of other victims' family members have said they still don't believe it was him.
Yeah, but all the evidence that's pointing to him, like, how do you not believe it's him after all that evidence?
So there's been so much conspiracy about the case after the fact because some people believe that none of it was Vlado, that it was pinned on him.
Yeah.
Some people believe that it was him, but because of the police investigation, especially in Mitra's disappearance in the first place, they effectively wanted to cover up the case and they didn't want it going to trial.
Yeah.
So Vlado had been killed. There was obviously the discussion about why he'd been taken to the overcrowded prison in the first place.
Yeah.
But these are all questions that we will just never know the answers to.
No.
The one thing that we do know is that all of the forensic evidence directly links Vlado to each of these murders.
To all three of these as well. It's not just one, and it's not just one piece of evidence.
No.
Like, how would his semen, how would his blood be there? How would he have the items of the victims
his home.
in his summer home? Like,
how would he have known the details for his articles?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, there's not really any doubt, but unfortunately, this can't go to trial when someone is dead.
So that's effectively the end of the case. The one thing that we did want to mention is that obviously because Vlado died, we still have a missing victim. So along with obviously the three victims, there was also Garita, who has still never been found. So she was the missing person that went missing on the 30th of May 2003.
Yeah.
And whether or not she was one of Vlado's victims, we'll never know. Her body's never been found, and obviously they now cannot ask Vlado. But we wanted to also obviously
mention her. Yeah.
So that's it for today's case. Again, a bit of a whirlwind, a real roller coaster, but hopefully you found that one interesting, and it's something a little bit different to the usual.
It is. So if you do the usual, make sure you're following us on social media, and we will see you next week for another case.
We will indeed.
Bye.
Take care.